And we appear to be live. How are we, everybody?
Fine.
Good morning.
Oh, good.
Yeah. I see by T.A. Newman's shocked response that he is totally fine as well.
Always.
Excellent. So depending on where we are, it might be early on a Saturday, maybe it's late on a Saturday, but we are gathered here today to talk about the role of isolation in horror. So let's see if we can breathe a little bit of life into this topic. My name is Alan Patric. I will be your panel moderator for today. But people aren't here to listen to me. They want to hear all of you wonderful individuals. So if we can do a once around the proverbial table here, I'd love to start with Petter. And what can you tell us about yourself and your works?
Well, my name is Petter. As you said, I work with the company Helmgast. It's evening here in Sweden where I sit. So it's pitch black outside and raining because of global warming, I guess. I am the creative director of Cult, Divinity Lost. I've written a lot of other Swedish role-playing games, but the Cult Divinity Lost is the only one in the English language right now. And I guess I'm isolated since I'm in Sweden. So.
Would you like to nominate somebody, or should I just choose?
I think you should pick. You are the dungeon master of this.
All right, right on. Scott.
Yes, thanks. I'm Scott Dorward. I have written a bunch of stuff for Call of Cthulhu, and these days I focus mainly on podcasting. I'm one of the co-hosts of the Good Friends of Jackson Elias podcast, and
we may have temporarily lost Scott.
The UK is suffering a significant bout of weather we're not used to.
Yeah.
Oh, jeez.
Am I there? I can hear you just fine. Can you hear me? Oh, that does not bode well.
Scott, we're losing you.
Oh shit! Can you not hear me at all?
Let's try. Oh my gosh. Okay, well Scott. We will bounce back to you. In the interim, let's keep some momentum here and move on to John.
Thank you. My name's John Hook. Similar to Scott, I have written quite a bit for Call of Cthulhu, and I'm also a podcaster. And it's morning here in Kansas.
Gotcha. So it's actually earlier for you than me. I'm like an hour outside of Detroit.
Oh,
nice. Travis.
Hello, I'm Travis Vengroft, sound designer, producer, editor, yada yada of The White Vault, an isolation horror podcast, and also Dark Dice, which is another isolation horror D&D actual play podcast, where I'm also the DM, or co-DM, depending on what season it is. I also have written some best-selling content on the DM's Guild, like Domain of the Nameless God, which is also isolation horror, and some other stuff too. And I'm here in Bavaria, Germany, in the mountains, trying to avoid Krampus, because it's Krampusnacht. He'll find us.
Fair. Newman.
Hello. I'm the host of the Miskatonic Playhouse, which is Call of Cthulhu horror podcast, YouTube channel. I'm also the chair of the Miskatonic Repository Convention, which is really exciting. It celebrates community work within the Call of Cthulhu realm, which, to be fair, a lot of that work is nowadays it's semi-professional. It's bordering. It's fantastic work from a fantastic community. And I've written 3 best-selling scenarios, one of which is 100% focused within the idea of isolation, and another of which really dabbles with isolation and Krampus. So there's your little connection there.
Always good to have a good Krampus reference. 'Tis the season and all that.
Exactly.
Scott, I think you might have stabilized. I'm hoping I'm not jumping the gun here.
I hope I'm back. I can hear everyone else just fine, but
I hope so.
Maybe I'm isolated. I don't know. Maybe that's the true horror for me.
Okay.
But yes, yeah, just to finish off, yes, as well as being co-host of the Good Friends of Jackson Liars, I am a regular cast member on the Ain't Slayed Nobody, How We Roll, and Grizzly Peaks Radio podcasts.
Okay. We did drop you a little bit. At least I dropped you a little bit on that. So I hope things stabilize. I hear there's some significant weather going on in your neck of the woods.
Yeah.
So we are all gathered here today to talk about isolation. And isolation can take a lot of forms. It means a lot of things to a lot of people, from cultural to natural isolation. You can look at it from a global standpoint. You can look at it from the microcosm of just your neighborhood, or all the way down to just your home, your domicile, the shipping container or tiny house you live in. What I'd like to find out is how each of you define isolation in your products, your games, your podcasts, your fiction, whatever your choice may be. And kind of like how we did introductions, I'd love to start with Patric.
Well, isolation, I think, is of course important in horror of all sorts. And I guess we use all kinds. But for cult, which is set in our modern day, often in an urban setting in big cities where everyone has cell phones, the isolation often has a supernatural tie-in. And where the isolation is created when you come to these locations between the worlds where you can't really, get help. Your cell phone doesn't work. But then there is also the big social isolation. You are in this city and you are just an individual and you don't know who you can trust for help. So I would say the focus in a modern horror game like Cult is more of the sort of social isolation, being alone in the world, and the sort of horror that haunts you. You can't really get help from the police or your neighbors. It's something you and the other player characters needs to deal with.
So as someone who's not familiar with Cult, that you said it puts you in more of a modern day setting, a more urbanized modern setting. Am I correct there?
Yes. It's often played in big cities in 2020 or 1990 or something like that.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, the social isolation can be very, very powerful.
Yeah, but I think it's also, it's always handy when you have a horror setting like Call of Cthulhu or like Call of Cthulhu Gaslight, when you are, driving or riding your horse cart to some isolated lighthouse and there's no people around and, you can't call for help. It creates a really good atmosphere. And I think which in itself is very good. And I think the building up towards isolation is super powerful when you are traveling towards the place that, if I end up in trouble, there is no help that will come for me. And that's harder in a modern setting because people are like, oh, I have my cell phone, I can always call for help, or I can contact another player character.
Okay, cool. Someone want to follow that?
Isolation is one of those primal instinct emotions that are easy to tap into, because the very first thing that we learn, not that we learn, but it comes to everyone instinctually as a child, is fear of the dark, right? Being alone in the darkness and needing help. I mean, there's a reason why when you want help, we call it a lifeline, because you feel like you need that help to save your life. So having isolation is that path to possible death, right? You're always afraid that at the end of that is death. And for players, when we play these games, it's so easy to tap into that. And players in any game can feel that, because everyone knows what it feels like to have that taste of isolation. And so to bring that into a game in whatever form that you're doing it in and playing it out is always entertaining. There's, because our audiences are modern, it's easy to have that isolation if the setting of your game is of an older technology. But I agree with Petter, when you have like the game Cult and it's set in modern day, and you still get that isolation effect, it has an even deeper feeling of fear for your players, because they can see that happening to themselves in real life, not just in a setting like, well, of course, if I was in the countryside and I was miles away and there's no cell phone towers, of course I would feel isolated. But if they can, you could do that in a modern day setting, it does hit much more deeper and more impactful. And that's why it's something like the movie Open Water, which isn't, special. It's not a supernatural movie, right? Open Water is two divers in Australia, scuba diving, and then the boat left them and forgot that they were still diving, and you're miles away from shore in shark-infested waters. You are truly isolated. I mean, that is a terribly scary movie for me, So, isolation is one of those primal instincts that's easy to tap into and a lot of fun to play at the table.
Nice. Scott, it sounded like you were trying to chime in there.
Yeah, well, all I was going to add to that, I think, is that isolation, I think, helps the players as well, because sometimes there is that reaction that you get in a horror game, which is, why would my character do this? Why would my character not just run away or call the police or, do any one of the sensible things that a normal human being would do in a bad situation? And by isolating them, by cutting them off from those forms of support, then you're giving the players permission to really engage with the horror in a way that may not make sense on a rational level. And also, I think it adds a psychological dimension as well. When you're trapped in a horrible situation with a group of other people, then that gives you reasons, or at least it puts you in a sort of psychological pressure cooker, where if there are any cracks in the relationships between the characters or internally within the characters themselves, then you're creating a situation where all that stuff is going to be under enormous amounts of pressure and is going to reach breaking point. And that is one of the most interesting things, at least for me, that can happen in horror.
Interesting. And we have Travis. I see a smile in there.
Yeah, it forces you to really look inside. So if you're isolation horror, let's say from a creation perspective, it's cool because you don't have to develop an entire world. You just have to develop the woods. So my old adventure takes place in the woods. It can be in any world. It doesn't matter. It's the woods. Bad things are in the woods. You're going to meet them. That's the adventure. But also from a player perspective, and as a player, isolation horror allows us to look within and kind of examine what makes our characters tick and what things could upset them in very fun ways. Or like from a puzzle, if you're a puzzler perspective, okay, we've got limited resources. We have the things we brought with us to the woods or to the lighthouse. And we've got Mother Nature as probably one of the big opponents we're dealing with is the weather, because the weather can change anything to you when you're isolated. Or starvation or resource management. So suddenly it's the puzzle of resource allocation, and like some of my favorite video games are like Frostpunk. The enemy is don't freeze to death. That's the great enemy. It's just manage what you have to survive the winter. And there are other games that take it on a one-on-one level or a bigger level, but ultimately this resource management puzzle can play a rather large role into it, and I think that's quite fun. In addition to any other supernatural horrors on top of what we would deal with being lost in the woods.
Right. And Newman?
Yeah. Obviously chiming in with everybody else, I think that there's some fantastic kind of coverage there of isolation. But I think I like the idea of what isolation can bring, and I think it was Scott talking about what it can do for the players. Obviously it gives you permission as a player to act in a certain way. As soon as I think there is a supernatural or preternatural experience, there is a sense of psychological isolation that you'll have from the rest of society, who won't believe you when you say these things are true. So even whether it's like Petter was saying, whether you're in a big city or not, whether Travis saying you're in the forest, there is that. But also, if you get that isolation along with your other players, it's like a shared isolation. I know that's almost contradictory of the word itself, but that the players themselves, they have to rely on each other, whether they like each other, whether they get on or not. And I think that codependency within isolation can be a really powerful gaming setup.
Shared trauma.
Yeah.
I actually
the best
would like
kind.
I would like to add a little bit to that. I think it's important to isolate the players from each other, because when they are a group, they have the resources. Like, if you're fancy, I'm the fighter, I'm the thief, I'm the wizard, or whatever, or in cult, your characters. But I like the scenes that appear. When you drag a character away from the group, or you separate them, and they have to sort of themselves fight or react to what's happening, and deal with their own dark secrets coming to life. Because I feel that you can have strong scenes when the group is isolated, and that can be sort of the setting for the scenario. We go deep into the woods, we are in the lighthouse, but when one of the sort of characters goes down into the basement alone in the lighthouse with the flashlight, or hear something in the woods, or get dragged away, and the other characters can sort of shift scenes between them and the other characters. I think that's also a very good, narrative technique. If you have some player in the group that perhaps doesn't get as much space, or has something interesting that you would want to see. I would want to see the sort of spoiled noble prince get isolated alone in the woods, without sort of his servants to help him. That would be an interesting, scene. So I think that's also very important to sort of separate the players as well.
I think, if I can jump in then, that sparks up another potential question then. When you are creating your content, when you're running your content, or engaging in your podcast, and whether that's scripted or live play, when it comes to having those moments of personal isolation, Petter, like what you just described, do you feel that that's going to be more impactful strictly one-on-one, like to the point where everyone else leaves the area, like the people actually leave the room, so it's just the storyteller, GM, DM, and the one player? Or do you feel you'll get more emotional resonance out of having everyone else see that spoiled noble prince get isolated and have to rely on their own skills?
I always want all the players to be invested in each character's story. And since Cult is a game where quite often when you are playing your campaigns, it depends on the scenario, of course. Some are more like mission-based, but it's not often it's quite common in Cult where you have several separate scenes with the separate characters, and then they are sort of tied together, and then they sort of, go out again. But the story has themes that tie them together. So I always want them to be in the room and be invested in that as well. So unless it's something that is super secret, does it do the pact with the forest god and sacrifice the others? Then it can be fun. If it's
we'd never do that
all the time.
But that does make me think of
Scott. Did you have some thoughts on that as well?
Yeah. I've often said that playing an RPG isn't necessarily a scary experience the way that watching a horror film or playing a horror video game can be. But the one time I've actually felt a bit scared playing a horror RPG was a one
again.
Yeah, it's hard to hear.
Shit. Hang on. I'll try switching my video off, see if that... Okay, I've switched my video off. Let's see if that helps at all. The one time I've actually found myself feeling kind of scared in a horror game was a one-on-one game in playing away from everyone else in a spooky old room in an observatory on top of a hill in Edinburgh. And we played this game of murderous ghosts, myself and Gregor Hutton, one-on-one. And the fact that we were cut off from the rest of the world as players, and so it wasn't just my character being isolated, it was me feeling like I was separate from the rest of the world, made me feel vulnerable while playing in a way that I never have before. That's not something that you can necessarily capture very easily, but I think it's a form of isolation that, if done right, can be incredibly powerful.
True. And as a side note, I think the video thing helped. Still got some kind of odd audio, but I was able to hear you there. So,
good.
Interesting notes about isolation and moving characters into new spaces, new be that narrative or mental. Newman, John, Travis, did you have some things to throw in? I saw you nodding, Travis.
I'm sort of the odd guy out. I separate people and I do things separately, but I also have a co-DM. It's myself and one other person. So when the party says, we're going to go different directions, and you're like, never do that in a horror movie. We're just like, okay, we have 2 DMs. Let's do this.
Okay.
But we do take people one-on-one aside for some of these things usually we'll sneak it at like a break, right? So everyone, we'll come back in 15, except you. And then they'll have something happen. And it's not something we do in our home games very often, but for the theatrical stuff, for our paid DMing experiences, that's like the sort of stuff that we engage in because we've sort of been, it is expected of us at this point, because we do weird things like we had this really fun campaign and the party split and we for like 4 hours with one group, 4 hours with the other, that everyone came back together and we continued the adventure. And the next session, like 2 players are missing. And then this one guy's like, yeah, they totally killed each other. And then we had this murder mystery element where one of the players had basically murdered 2 of the others. And, well, who are you going to trust? But one of them survived. And then had a different story, but he was the unreliable guy. No one really trusted him. So we had an absolute blast with it. It doesn't work with every group. You need buy-in. But the psychological moments of returning back to a group and there's fewer people, or again, that's our professional thing for the podcast. So we can be like, oh yeah, you're dead. Goodbye. It's not like our weekly game where you're like, okay, we got to get you to roll a new character or something. It can be quite traumatizing and also scary and up the stakes, like Scott was saying, where you're feeling it. But it doesn't work with every group, but it can work. And I do implore you to try it if you think your group would be, if you have the buy-in from your group. How about that? Not if you think, but if you have the buy-in.
Okay. No, that's a good point. You touch on another topic I'd love to hear everyone's input on. How does isolation horror change when you move from like physical in-person games to like digital platforms, whether it's like a digital DMing, GMing experience or video game experience? John, can I start with you?
I mean, I haven't experienced many differences in that at all. The gameplays that I do in person versus online, it's a very similar effect, and I think it's because the feelings of isolation are so universal and can come across and strike true in a player that it's easy for them to feel that. It doesn't take as much of a heavy lifting from the game master's perspective and their angle to try and describe that and bring it to the table. The players bring a lot of themselves to it. You just have to lead them there, and they'll go. But yeah, and the isolation can come in so many variety of ways. I have a scenario that I wrote where it's set aboard a luxury liner, and you're traveling across the Atlantic. And there are serpent people, and one of your friends goes missing. And you have to figure out what's happened to him. And some people say they've seen him, and some people aren't so sure. And you just got to figure out what's going on and see if you can recover him before it gets to Liverpool and it can get away.
Okay. Anyone else have some thoughts to throw in?
The first scenario I published is called The Prisoner's Dilemma. I live on the south coast of England, and one of our famous lovely landmarks that's literally just a little drive away is Dartmoor. Huge barren expanse, beautiful location, a lot of Sherlock Holmes and the Hand of the Baskervilles is set up there. It's quite a fantastic place, but what's unique about it is because it's such a environmentally barren and difficult location. A long time ago in the Regency era, the Prince of Wales decided to build a prison on it, and the idea was that the prison for Napoleonic prisoners was, even if you escape the prison, good luck. That was the idea. You can't go anywhere. It's so inhospitable. So that was, and I remember going up there, and I had some friends who were working there at the time, and I spoke to them, and I've written a scenario based up there, and that was my first experience of writing it. And I think because of the nature of writing something based in such an isolated location, and maybe this was my, I suppose, novice writing at the time as well, years and years ago, was that it is still a mystery. There's huge aspects to the mystery of what's going on. They get locked in one of the wards, and it's about finding their way through the cells, the guard's office, going down into the basements and the caves below. But it started to turn into a bit of a dungeon crawl through Call of Cthulhu, which is great fun. And it's a great, I suppose, evening's worth of scenario, and it's not the easiest one to survive, but the isolation aspect of it is the characters go there of their own free will, going to go and see a prisoner who's requested their attendance, and then they kind of get locked in and shut in, and it becomes almost like an escape from Dartmoor scenario with preternatural horrors involved. That I've run that both in person and I've run that both online. I don't know. There is something about being online where you are. I mean, if we all look where we are now, we've all got headphones on. We're all in our own rooms. We don't tend to be physically or vocally interacting with other people within our offices or sheds, wherever we are. And I think that actually provides some aspect of the isolation. Whereas if I'm in a room with other people, there's a very I am in a room with other people and doing isolation, which is fantastic. So I do love playing in person, but playing that Prisoner's Dilemma online with people, it's had a really kind of like nice vibe to it, because people do kind of, you see them looking over their shoulder and things and recognizing they are on their own. And they're either on camera like this with each other, or sometimes you do it and it's just voice. It can be quite a bizarrely anonymous experience, isolating in itself.
Yeah. I can see that. It sounds like a really interesting scenario. I'm not super exposed to like the 7th edition stuff for Call of Cthulhu, but that does sound really cool.
It's fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say that when you're playing in person as well, it's much more of a social experience, so that perhaps defangs the sense of isolation, even more than just the fact that there are people around you. It feels more intimate. You feel more connected. It's simply because it is a social gathering. But yeah, playing online, playing when you're particularly alone in the house, can be a far more creepy experience. And I think for horror, I've come to prefer playing online for just that reason.
Interesting.
I think there is a third way of doing it as well, which it is much more, takes more effort. But I like the idea of isolating yourself as a group, playing in an isolated location, a horror scenario. For example, we played a horror scenario that was set in an old lighthouse, and we managed to rent a house on an island with an old lighthouse, but we were sort of transported there by boat. and had to leave. And then we had like, in 3 days, this person hopefully will come and pick you up. Like, okay, we still had our cell phones, so it was a bit cheating, but it was still when we played like a scenario about a lighthouse, at a lighthouse, and it was like night and raining. I think that everyone felt like we are in this environment, you know, we are in this place, and I think in a cabin in the woods also can give you this experience where you are isolated together.
I will echo that. That's super cool. I love the lighthouse idea of being on an island. That's fantastic. A lot of our experience has been playing by candlelight in a literal dungeon at D&D in a castle. Like that's been a lot of our playtesting experiences, and that's been really cool to just be like, you're in the dark except for some candles and some tea or coffee, and like you're going to be there for like 24 of the next like 72 hours, something like that. But you're like, you're in a basement with no natural light talking about like, okay, we're going to be in an underground adventure, or we're going to go into a place where there is no light for the next couple of days. And like, you know, you could play with the lights and make it dimmer and dimmer and dimmer till it's just candles. And being able to interface with your environment in those sorts of immersive ways have been quite enjoyable on our end. And also for puzzles, because Caitlin writes a lot of puzzles, my partner and co-DM, they don't quite hit as well online a lot of the time if they're involved like physical manipulation of things, like you find parts of a cube, like one of the players forgot how many sides a cube had, for instance, because we're not thinking, we're tired, and you've got like, guys, we got to find 2 more pieces. Why? Because the cube has 9 sides.
It's a non-Euclidean cube.
Exactly.
Or non-Pythagorean, I guess. Interesting. I'm working on caffeinating. My apologies. I will say that you know, when you put your groups into that isolated space, when you're doing a physical game, it can change the way the game runs. Just from my own experience, years ago, I owned a game store, and massive storm rolled through. We lost power. My gamers got the bright idea, and this was right around Halloween. They got the bright idea to run their weekly Call of Cthulhu game in the basement. And this was, you know, here in the U.S., like, we don't have a whole lot of history. So when I say that our store was about 120 years old, that's old for us. Creaky wooden floors, the whole 9 yards. And playing in the basement was an experience they talked about for years. Because it was, you know, candlelit, and every time somebody walked around upstairs, dust would filter down, and they just it made their night. So let me pose this then: how do you engage with a player, and sometimes a character, but let's target the player who is reluctant to engage with the isolation aspect of your game? Does the question make sense?
Yeah.
In what respect? Sorry, Alan. In like, if they are uncomfortable being isolated.
Yes.
Well, I think initially, I mean, as long as if you've had conversations before, we've kind of looked at content warnings, and and I know that that's something that it's always worth talking about, but we're also all kind of proficient with, and I think everybody would really kind of expect those conversations to happen. But I think as soon as someone perhaps does show discomfort or a dislike for kind of doing that, it might be either with them at the table, or offering to have it as a should we take 5 minutes and saying is there a way you'd like to do this? We could do it, could talk about your character in the third person, or we could just kind of narrate this rather than put you in the spot and feel like you have to kind of come up with this, and I can give you these things. I suppose it'd be finding a workaround, or specifically if it's something that they're uncomfortable with. It could be that, especially if you have already kind of gone over lines and veils and things, it might be that there's another player at the table who's happy to take on that part of the narrative. And I suppose a quick thinking GM might be able to go, ha ha ha, you went through that door and you went through that door. Turns out you're the one that's isolated. So as long as, I suppose it's like having a really good, crucial handout, isn't it? That within your game, you know it's going to further. It's a necessary handout. It's something that someone needs to find, and if they don't open the drawer and find the thing, you move it somewhere else, so that someone can find it at a different time in a different way. So perhaps it's about just sharing that out, so it takes the pressure off that individual. I think that's the core thing, isn't it? Is making sure that they don't feel, they feel included and they're happy to play in what they want to play.
At the same time, I don't think there's anything wrong with admitting as a player, or perhaps, if you're the GM, suggesting it to the player that, the game isn't a good fit for them. Because I've certainly been in the situation a number of times. I mean, mostly with one particular player, but I've seen it elsewhere, with a person who kept wanting to play horror one-shots that I was running that did involve, in a lot of cases, isolation, but just horror in general, where she seemed really taken with the concept of the game, but as soon as her character was in a dangerous situation, cut off, there was physical threat around, she would kind of withdraw, not just withdraw into herself as a player, but she'd do everything she could to disengage her character from the situation, just hide from everything and leave it to everyone else to deal with. And to the extent where it just didn't seem to make any sense for her to be part of the game. It was this really weird thing of, I don't know if anyone else has had this experience with players. It's something, again, I've seen a few times of, I'm going to do everything I can as a player to stop my character engaging with this situation, and it's your job as the GM to make them. Which I think is a highly dysfunctional thing. I think if you're a player and you know that you're going into a game where your character is going to be facing horrors, is going to be cut off from the world, is going to have to deal with survival horror or whatever it is, I think you as a player have to buy into that. And if you're not willing to do so, then maybe just reconsider whether that style of gaming is for you. It sounds like you're not having fun.
Yeah,
the direct conversation.
I think it's a really good point that to say that some games are not for everyone, and some this is probably, if you don't like this kind of scenario, perhaps you shouldn't partake in it. I don't think it should be used as sort of a bullying tactic, but I think it's.
Oh yeah.
You need, when you are playing horror, you need a buy-in, and I think it goes for every other game as well. If we're playing a very dungeon crawly D&D scenario, and you're like, yeah, but I just want to have more social and intriguing. I don't want to sort of fight and need to learn anything about the rules. I just want to, But
I just want to roll in and hit stuff.
yeah. I mean, so if the premise is like, but this is a very sort of combat focused scenario and campaign, then you're probably not correct for that one either. I always like when players have I think it's important with the player buy-in to what kind of game it is and to what kind of story it is, because I like it when players, they put themselves in danger somehow. I don't like when, I mean, it's the whole that play unsafe. And it, of course, depends on the system. But if people are too scared, like if you're playing like classic Call of Cthulhu and no one dares to open a book and read it, or, go down into the basement because what about the cultists? I mean, you want them to do that, and you want one of them to go down into the basement and the other one go into another room and I will read the book, Okay, now we have a suspenseful situation. But if you just kill them as a game master, then it's, of course, very boring. So then the players will learn that, let's not just do that. We just sit here in the dark with our guns.
I reckon Petter reads the book whilst going into the basement and shouting at the cultists.
Yes.
You're doing it wrong.
Enunciation.
What I tell people when they're struggling with that is that if they're playing Call of Cthulhu, it says in the character sheet, investigator, not bystander.
Yes.
Yeah, good point.
And it generally doesn't say anything about you being much of a fighter either.
Yes.
I have had it, because I like to, most of the time when I'm running a game in person, it's at a convention setting. most of my private games are online. But when I've been at conventions and I'm meeting new players, meeting new people, and maybe they're just trying out the game, and they start to, and you can see and feel that they want to separate themselves, because maybe the isolation is striking too close down on. I try not to punish them. I'll just say, and I'll divert and say, I'll ask them, are you trying to get your character to escape? Yes, I want to escape. Okay. Let's move on, and I'll let move on to another player who can kind of step up and do, heroic type of actions or whatever, or do the investigations. And I'll ask the character, I go, was your character, did they want to escape? Yes. Do you think your character was able to successfully escape? Yes, I think. Okay, you did escape. And I just let them escape. And they can sit there, and eventually they're going to get to see, like, oh, if I want to actually play the game, I have to participate, because I'll ask them, if you want to escape, I let it happen. And they can just watch, and we'll continue to play. And eventually they're like, can I come back? Or sometimes they just do leave,
I think that would open some interesting narrative doors too. Like, oh, your character left for the last couple hours of gameplay, and now you're back. Where have you been? What have you done?
Right.
There's nowhere to go. We've already checked. Where have you been? So, all of that said, we've brought up a lot of really cool points and ways to interact with our players when they have strong reactions. So, what value then do you see in incorporating elements of isolation into your games? Like, what's the draw for you as the storyteller or GM, DM?
It's so fun. I don't know why you didn't want to. It's like, one, you can kind of, I don't want to say railroad, but like your story is defined by survival or not in a lot of senses. Like, or successive mission, maybe not actual them surviving, but them accomplishing a goal, which is usually survival or not. So I find it simplifies a story, and you can have all of your narrative be present, and they can skip it and still survive or accomplish their goals in some instances. I read an RPG where it's like all of the story you can completely skip and just survive, and you can just ignore the rest of this. Why is this island this way? What happened here? Oh, it doesn't matter. We're just going to get off the island. And you get off the island. Like, you can do things like that, or it allows you to really focus on specific interactions with your party. So you can, I don't want to say like premeditate, but you can premeditatively like figure out, okay, like they're probably going to wind up doing this. So I can put a lot of forethought into making this encounter really meaningful or impactful, or making sure that these narrative moments really hit as hard as I would like them to. So for me, it allows a lot of time to focus, because as a DM, preparation is a big thing for me, because I don't have visual ideas in my head. So I have to write out descriptions ahead of time or think about them. And it allows me that ability, so I can just be like, okay, I can write a paragraph about how creepy this thing smells or sounds, or all the things we would experience of it. And it can be a lot more gruesome than trying to improvise, because I'm not a strong improviser, and that limits to some extent the variables.
And that focus that you talk about there, I think, is also something that's very important for players, because sometimes when you're thrown into a scenario as a player, there can be a bit of fumbling around, depending on how strong the hook is, to work out what the hell it is that you're up against, what you're supposed to be doing, what the premise of the scenario is. But as soon as you create that isolation, then you're cutting off all the unnecessary options. So, I mean, I've written a number of scenarios that are set in sort of weird pocket universes where people stumble into them, and you're suddenly in this bad place, and it's about survival, it's about escape, it's about learning what the hell's going on. And that is just such an immediate hook, both as a GM and as player, that it gets rid of all the messing around. Yeah, you're there. What are you going to do about it?
We had you.
All right. I'd finished on that. Sorry.
Okay.
Well, I
Gotcha.
I could add something to Scott's thing there. I think for me it's three things I really like about isolation. First of all, it's so fundamental, as John says, it's so fundamental in horror that it's like the broth where you make the stew. It's sort of part of that. But I think that Scott said something really good, that it sort of removes distractions. It removes, especially in a modern setting, but it removes all the other stuff. You just have to, you can have focus on the woods, as Travis talked about, or the horror. The second thing I think is that isolation also creates desperation. And I think desperation leads to very interesting scenes where characters are pushed and you get to learn much more about them when they crack, when they lose things, when they get injured. And it sort of creates a very intense thing. But I think one of the favorite things I like with isolation is the build-up. When you sort of start the scenario or you start the act, depending on where you are, where you sort of have this normal world, and then you sort of go deeper towards it and get more and more cut off. I think, like, if to go really classical horror, you can go back to Bram Stoker's Dracula, where you have Jonathan Harker traveling through Eastern Europe, and it's kind of normal, and then it comes to Bistritz, and you take a carriage, and it's night, and people are like, "Oh, Count Dracula," poof. And then they leave. The carriage leaves him in the middle of nowhere, and there's comes a strange other carriage and picks him up to this castle that's more like a ruin, and you're like, "Okay, now you're isolated." But I think the whole build-up to that for players creates, and it's sort of, you create the atmosphere, the tension. You sort of know what the scenario is about, or sort of the themes of it is about. So I think those three things, the sort of build-up of atmosphere, the removing of distraction, and the creation of desperation is key for me.
Nice.
There's some really nice, talking about those three things there. I think atmosphere and mood are crucial when it comes into isolation as well, because it really sets the tone of what you can do. And as the GM, if you can set that tone and then let the players help build that as well through their, as Petter's saying, through their desperate actions, because isolation is driving the desire to change the situation they're in. We've talked a bit about different types of isolation, whether it's environmental, whether it's because of the location, whether it's because of an experience, because of a supernatural exposure, and therefore they feel perhaps that they are the only ones that have experienced this, therefore they're special or different or frowned upon or looked upon. But I think that's really important. I know Scott, this is something that Scott wanted to talk about at some point, and we've touched on, is the idea of social isolation. And I know that in itself can take loads of different forms. And I really like the idea of, even though so in the new Cthulhu Gaslight book, there's a whole section which is on class interaction, and it kind of exposes what that's been in the Victorian world, really, where you can look at, okay, well, if you're from this class and something goes horribly, horribly wrong, who are you going to turn to? Because there are different aspects of society that won't engage with you, won't believe you, won't humour you. Or if you are from the upper echelons of society and you say, I saw this horrible thing, your entire reputation, your credibility. So there's really lovely tools to play with isolation in so many different ways, whether it is something as classic as Event Horizon on a spaceship, whether it's The Thing, and we're all looking at Clark, or whether it's whether it is something where it's reputable. And there's been some really good, I think, over the last few years, there's been some really good books, whether it's a setting book or a campaign book or module or whatever, that have explored more societal isolation in that respect. And I think it's very obviously very prevalent in today's society. Again, I think that can be a little bit Marmite with an audience, and when I say that, what I mean is that people can either love it or hate it. They love that where they're exploring something, or they might go, hang on a minute, that's the real world. I don't want that right now. I want to do Event Horizon Isolation, because that's not real world. So
we're getting enough real world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the real world. Everybody roll sanity, and then exactly.
But I think
So that's. Oh no, go ahead, Scott.
Oh, thanks.
Go
But
ahead.
I think you don't even have to. I mean, yes, class and marginalised identities and so on play a huge part in social isolation. But I don't think you even have to go that far. I read a novel fairly recently, which I'd highly recommend to anyone who wants to think about other forms of social isolation in games, which is Incidents Around the House by Josh Malerman. And it's about a family with a young girl, 8-year-old girl, who start experiencing some weird hauntings. There's a supernatural entity that seems to have taken an interest in the girl. And it starts out with it kind of being like a classic imaginary friend, until the adults in her life start seeing it as well and realize it is absolutely fucking terrifying. And the parents start trying to reach out to their extended family and friend group and so on for help. But as more and more people see this entity and it starts intruding into their lives, they just cut off ties with the family. And so it becomes like the entire social structure that they depend on for help and support just collapses, just dissolves, and they are left dealing with this on their own. And so it's set in suburban America, it's set in the modern day, and you think there would be all sorts of ways that they could get help, but Malerman just absolutely skillfully demolishes each and every one of them. They do all the right things. They go for help to all the people you'd expect, and it just all goes wrong. And it's an absolute masterclass in social isolation.
I've just read the blurb for that book, Scott. It's going to need to be bought.
What book is that?
Incidents
Around the House by Josh Malerman.
Yeah.
I think you can also create this social isolation by creating I would almost call it an abstract world, or a world where, as a game master, if you're playing an urban, modern horror game, and you sort of from the beginning, we are playing in the city. You are the detective, you live in the city, and above it is your neighbor. But you sort of make the world distant in a way, I'm screaming for help. Well, the people, you don't know if they understand your language. They're looking at you. You can almost do it in a sort of an abstract way where it can be in the characters' heads as well. Or I guess if you play in a fantasy setting and you put it in a completely different culture where no one knows the language or the customs, you can also get this feeling of isolation even if you're in a big city. And it can also be very creepy. Then it becomes sort of the, body snatchers thing when people are not acting at all as you would expect.
I'll add one more piece to that if I can, which is just like, okay, you survived your physical isolation, but you've seen some stuff and you're now no longer like everyone else. And the party, your group of people has this shared trauma that you've bonded through. And like, when you see a shadow, it doesn't mean the same thing to you as it does to other people who just farm all day.
Alan, sorry, it's such a good point, I think, and everyone's saying such wonderful things. I'm actually preparing for a game after this, which is going to be run by Electric Rancid, and it is a cult game, Petter. So looking just in preparation for that, and I think in preparation for other games, oftentimes a backstory or the setup for a game, especially for certain characters, can be really powerful in isolating you. I know some people love it, some people hate it, but also like in the Alien role-playing game, everybody gets given their motivation or their secret thing that they have, and it's not any private scene or anything like that. It's just something that you have going in. And I was very lucky when I got to play the Alien role-playing game. I'll try not to do any spoilers, but I got to play the wonderful company man, and I feel like I excelled at it. The really horrible, smarmy company man. And it was great. It was so much fun. But when you play that character, you're given that character's information before the game even starts. So you're going in with a sense of, I've got my own little thing. And I think I took pleasure in that little bit of isolation, because it did also mean there were certain things that I couldn't reveal and I couldn't do, but it was great because I think, like Petter said earlier, sometimes you want to make the fun, dangerous choices because it's part of the game, it's part of the experience, and if you've got your own reasons why, without having to explain it, apart from the GM, obviously, who knows, it can be really exciting to use isolation for individuals to explore different areas of the scenario or the campaign.
Yeah. I mean, I think it has so much to do with the format. If you're playing like let's start a level 1 to 20 D&D campaign, and then like, I will have all my secret plots that goes against the other characters. It will derail it. You need to sort of buy in, like this is what we're playing. But if you're playing like Alien, we're going to play Alien for like this night. Then it's like go full on, do the weird shit, and then if you die, you get a new character. It's like you then you should really explore and push it. And that's what I like with one shots and horror. That as players you can sort of afford to do crazy stuff, because especially towards the end, you will probably it's not I won this game. It's like how do you win this game? The winning is probably the winning can be like, I will open the gate to Yoggoth and
as you do.
Close the gate.
Open the gate a little.
Leroy Jenkins, or something like that.
So let me pose this to everybody then. With everything that we've gone over here, if you had one suggestion you could make to anyone who's listening now or in the future, how would you suggest that they raise the stakes for isolation games that they run? Like, what is the one tool that you would love to see them deploy? One suggestion you'd give them?
That failure has drastically larger consequences than their own deaths. If you're trying to rescue the children from the village, that's why you're in this isolation horror, or you're going to unleash the terrible thing upon the world if you don't close the door or open the door so it can go somewhere else. But giving them a reason beyond survival to get them really invested, that is, they have to get the cure or else someone will die. Like, they got to make it back, or one person has to make it back with the cure. Whatever that magical sauce might be, having a hook that returns them back to something their characters care deeply about and can roleplay with can be very useful. And I think having that buy-in can extend the life of your, I'm not going to say gimmick, because it's not a gimmick. It's the sauce. It is the sauce.
It is the sauce.
Okay. I'd say use the player's natural impulse to try to get help against them. So, if they're in a situation where they can try to call for help from the authorities or from some outside source, then maybe they do manage to get through, but who or what turns up is not what they expect, or the situation by the time the authorities turn up has gone so far to shit that the player characters look like the guilty party in it, and they've now got two problems to deal with. So, people will always, I think, want to try to get that outside help, and I think you can get some real horror out of subverting that.
Just leading off Scott's thing there, where the players reach out for help. I'm a big fan of huge atmosphere, mood building, really creating that almost tangible environment for everybody to kind of sit in and enjoy and try and escape. I think that idea of when it's how the isolation is introduced. So rather than going and you find yourself isolated and just laying it out there, I know that can be useful, but you love it when they pick up the phone and it's dead, or they go to their phone and when it rings before they dial anything and someone just laughs down the phone. You want them to discover the isolation themselves, because it could be that happens in small increments. It could be that they get one big wallop. That in itself is a series of small horror vignettes that kind of builds up to a bigger picture. And I think that the fact that the players find that themselves is a bit of a treat. And I think as a GM, if you've got that ability to kind of go, oh yeah, this just come to my head in this moment, this is going to be great. It's a really lovely thing to be able to do. Yeah.
Years ago, I wrote 4 short Call of Cthulhu scenarios, and I actually call them isolated investigator scenarios because they're designed to be 1 keeper and 1 player. So, a way to really bring isolation to the forefront is reduce the number of players that you've got, right? If your player doesn't have anyone else at the table that they can lean to and say, "Can you help me?" Right? That is already a level of isolation. And I remember, unfortunately, these are no longer in print, and I am working on trying to get them back into print. But when I was running one of these games, again, I had 1 player, and to Scott's point, this player thought he needs to call the police. He needs the police because that's what they're here for, right? The cops are here to do this, to confront bad things. And so he went to the police, and it was a small town, really, Barney Fife kind of, Mayberry kind of town. And so he's talking to the local cop and tells this cockamamie story of what's going on, and the police should go investigate it. And the cops were like, okay, this sounds ridiculous. He goes, yes. I go, for your safety and mine, I'll go do this, but I would like you to wait inside the holding cell. And the player was like, okay. And I was like, all right. So I went into the holding cell. The cop shut the door. The cop left and died. But he doesn't know this. And so then finally a different cop shows up. He's like, who are you in the cell? What's going on? He tells the cockamamie story again. And the cop left and died. And he eventually just died of starvation in the cell because he decided to choose the authorities instead of dealing with it himself. So that happens.
Yeah.
I think that... sorry.
Oh, no, sorry. Sorry, Patric, carry on.
I was just going to say that the thing I was supposed to say, Scott already said, so I blame him for taking the good points. But I would, if it's one advice, I think the one that try to isolate the player characters from each other as well, as I said before. But I also think that you can create, I don't know if it's part of the feeling of isolation, but we can isolate a character and then you can sort of create an atmosphere where you don't really explain what happened. For example, let's take the Travis Lost in the Woods scenario, and the nobleman is sort of dragged off into the woods, and the other characters are looking for him, and it's nowhere to be seen. And the next scene is towards morning. He comes stumbling back, and it's more like, yeah, you remember you were dragged down to some sort of dark place beneath a tree, and it was wet and worms, and there was something there that whispered things in your ear and clinged onto you, and you still feel that thing clinging onto you. That's all you remember. So you don't tell them the scene, you tell them something vague, and just to create some sort of I might have had a weird experience, but since the players haven't heard it, they haven't listened to the scene, it's more of building some sort of atmosphere that something clearly happened, but you sort of almost isolate the players from the plot as well before you reveal it. So it's more like a narrative thing. But it can become quite creepy when it's more of a... So it clinged to me. Yeah, you don't really remember. It was something beneath a tree.
You're spoiling my podcast.
Hang on, now I got to remove my notes for my next adventure.
Yeah.
But also
one thing that a couple... Oh, you've heard, Scott. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. No. I think I might be lagging slightly, which isn't helping. Thinking of ways of using as well the player characters' impulses against them. I mean, the other thing that player characters will try to do in bad situations is escape it. And I think the impulse as GMs and as scenario writers is to try to put blocks in that way. Let's say you've got a bunch of people who've gone out to investigate this isolated island. They've got a boat, they've gone out to the island, and they've discovered something horrific there. And the characters do the sensible thing and think, right, we're going to get the hell out of here, jump on the boat, and get away. And so I think the first impulse a lot of us would have is, the engine fails to start on the boat, or it's been sabotaged somehow. It's not going to work, you're not going to get away. But you could also go the other way and sort of say, right, the boat starts up and you get on board and you start chugging away. And then you slowly introduce the idea that perhaps the bad thing that they were scared about has found its way onto the boat with them as well. And they're now in an even smaller, more isolated place with it. And that's not going to go well for them. That's not going to go well at all.
Okay.
I really like that. I was just going to add as well, for number of players can also be variable. The number of players at a table over a long campaign is not always consistent. Sometimes we have guests. Sometimes we lose people. One gimmick that we have is sometimes we start with a smaller group and then it's a larger party than they thought they were going to have that they stumble upon during the exploration and the isolation, and we add another player. Or more often than not, we had a plant who joined the party from the beginning, and then suddenly it was like, oh, it was a party of 4. And now it's like, nope, it's a party of 3. 4 just died. Or betrayed the party in some really terrible way. And we got to meet the villain a little bit beforehand, but like that, they played a specific role as like the mole or the plant. And we've used that. I've been the mole more often than not, but it's been kind of fun at our home tables.
In one of our early recordings, I was very lucky actually. In fact, actually, it was in we did a huge Regency campaign, Cult and Culpability, for Call of Cthulhu. Scott was in it. Scott was the classic agent of chaos that Scott is. Absolutely fantastic. But one of my good friends, who's a really good voice actor as well, he committed to it, but then some life circumstances changed his ability to commit, and he kind of spoke to me privately about that. And I was like, of course, this is a game, your life, we do this. I said, what do you want to do? He said, can you kill me really horribly? I went, yes, don't tell anybody. And literally the part of the narrative was I said, Pal's not going to be here for this session. Let's just carry on. I said it fits in with the narrative. Anyway, we started recording, and then they put in a few things that they wanted to just kind of like get to a certain point where they could bring him back in. And obviously they found his body in a horrific state, and it gave the group a sense of isolation, because it gave them like that vulnerability within society. I think that collective vulnerability and that shared vulnerability, again, a little bit like the I've seen something, it exposed them to nobody else is in the same situation as us. We've discovered something horrific and we're the only ones that know about it. But the fact that it was another player that died, a little bit like Travis was saying, there was a unexpected mole or unexpected stooge. It created a really kind of palpable atmosphere within the group, a really palpable mood that was really telling, that everybody went, oh, right, I think Newman might actually just kill us if we put foot wrong. And it was great fun.
Nice. I like it. So if someone were to come up to you and say, I'm just now warming up to the idea of being a player in these horror games, in these, whether it's isolation or something else, what should I do to better prepare myself? Is there a specific product, or and it could be your product or someone else's, or movie or book that you would recommend that individual check out prior to, say, joining an isolation-themed game that you were going to run? I know it's tough choosing one.
A book I'd recommend, and it's perhaps not an obvious one, is The Ritual by Adam Neville. It was filmed a while back. And
stop recommending books, Scott.
There's a movie for this too.
Oh yeah, the film is okay.
Rafe Spall.
Yeah, that's right. The film's
Yes,
the film is okay, but I don't think it captures what makes the book so perfect for this, which is I think the book is the purest form of isolation. Sorry, no, I'll say that again. The book is the purest form of survival horror, but driven by isolation that I've encountered in book form, because it is. Sorry, as one of you was saying before, it might have been Travis, talking about the resource management side of isolation. They're doing things like counting down the amount of candy bars they've got left and things like that, and trying to work out the calorific content and whether this is going to be enough to get them to the one bit of the clearing that they can see off in the distance, or whether they're going to keel over from exhaustion and starvation before they get there. And that kind of horror, that feeling of limited resources, being cut off from everything else, and just the horror in the area conspiring against you. I don't think I've encountered anything that's captured that quite so perfectly as that book.
God, it's a brilliant suggestion. I watched the movie on a whim myself when it first hit Netflix here in the U.S. And no one I have talked to in my circles, even though a lot of us are into horror, none of them were aware of it. And it quickly became angry messages of, what did I just watch?
That's great. It is a great movie, isn't it? And obviously Scott's saying the book is superior. Yeah, which is often the case.
The book's much better, yeah.
Oh, brilliant. It's going on my buy list.
I think, Alan, just going back to the question as well, what would you recommend? I think it depends on the person and their exposure or their medium that they're used to, what's their thing. So obviously I think we all know a bunch of movies we could recommend to greater or lesser extent of horror that would kind of make you go, oh yeah, I want to play this, or no way, I'm not going anywhere near that. But yeah, I think we're almost a bit too lucky at the minute, to the point where we might even be getting a bit saturated. But there is some fantastic stuff that's coming out in terms of series, films. There's lots of great things, that come out and represent that. I think if you had someone that was absolutely, really into that horror, to give them a broad spectrum. Not too long ago, I know not every episode would represent that idea of isolation, but Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities, it's a nice broad range. It's got lots of different things in there, and I know at least one or two episodes in there is very isolation based. But I think also the idea of cosmic horror or horror in general, horror tropes, horror things, you could, as long as they are okay to watch that as an individual, I think that would be a really good starting place to allow someone to get a broad spectrum of what they might get a vibe for in these types of games.
Okay. Yeah.
I had a book that I was going to recommend too, which is the Ruins by Scott Smith. There's also a movie for that, and the movie's actually not bad. It's a pretty good adaptation of the book. But it's great because it's these young hipster kids on a vacation in like Cancun or something, and they go out to this to go see a remote pyramid, right? Ruined pyramid. And there is something horrible there, and the natives that live in that area, like the actual, farming community that lives out there, they also know that there's something horrible there, and if anybody makes the mistake of going up on that thing, that community comes together to make sure that you don't come down. And they just, it's so awesome. It's really, really well done, and it's a great, it's supernatural, so there's a great creature effect thing in there, and it's pretty good.
Nice.
Well, I think for a player, not a game master, I wouldn't really. I think it depends a lot on what kind of game I would be running. And I don't think it's necessarily... I think I would go more for the theme. What is the setting? I mean, this is a game about horror, but if you're playing like Victorian England, I would find some sort of movie that would be... Watch this to get the feeling of the atmosphere, and it will be scenes of horror and things like that. But I think that it's I think that for players that are especially new to this, if they feel that they need to do a homework, it becomes so big. It can feel like, oh, I need to memorize this movie, I need to understand this. I think it's easier to have just a conversation and say, like, we're going to play this. The focus will be on isolation. It's not about winning for your character. If we're playing Cult, for example, it's more about exploring your character, and you can always stop the game, and we have, can have your, if things becomes too unpleasant, but really to make it feel simple for them to come in and say, like, just start, and we will start slow, we will start normal. I will take, perhaps scenes with other characters so they can sort of experience what that is by watching them, and try to actually remove any sort of, don't worry about it. We will take it step by step. You don't have to feel... I mean, you can read things to sort of, if you want to sort of get the understanding what kind of game it is or what kind of setting it is, but just come there and feel it out. I want to sort of lower it as much as possible, and rather have a short conversation where they should feel like they can't do anything wrong, really.
Okay,
that's genius advice. I think practice makes perfect, or it makes better and improves. And the more you can do, the more you can play, the better you'll be at it. You can certainly research the topic or whatnot, but the more you get to improvise, the more you get to play, the more you get comfortable with maybe the mechanics, if they're a bit clunky at first. But the mechanics shouldn't hold you back if you've got a good GM running you. Like, it's about the story and the storytelling and the buy-in and like the rules of improv. Yes, and okay, I have my hand is turning into something, or maybe I've just become infected with a disease. I have a spell cure disease, but that like totally, like, okay, maybe I'm embracing the disease. Maybe the disease is a part of my new personality. Like, how can I make this interesting? So by experiencing more, or trying to take in media of a similar kind, or just playing more, that is the best way to prepare, by playing and doing other things that are similar, or a similar system, I think, to expand your mind and broaden your horizons of what could be horrible in your future and very fun for everyone else.
Yeah,
right on.
That buy-in aspect that you mentioned is the vital bit. Yeah, you have to be absolutely on board for the horror, and you have to be willing as a player to think, all right, this might be the sensible thing to do, but what would be a fun thing to do, and what would a character in this kind of media do, and perhaps lean into that.
Interesting. So let me pose this then. We've focused quite a bit on horror centric. I mean, clearly we're at a horror event. We want to talk about the horror stuff. Do you feel that there's a strong role, a strong opportunity for humor to be present in isolation themed games?
Oh, heck yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. The emotional roller coaster, you have to, if you're going to bring them into the depths of horror, you have to also bring them into the heights of fun and humor, because it will make the drop into the next horror, more profound.
Oh, mania, yeah.
You can't just keep it down in the basement. You have to have that roller coaster.
Okay.
Yeah.
A lot of the time in creating theatre and film, the old the ideal way to treat an audience is like an elastic band over your two thumbs. And the idea being that this represents the tension and suspense that you create. And obviously the tension is when you pull your thumbs apart and the elastic band starts to tighten. And this is representative of how you make the audience feel in regard to mood and atmosphere. Yeah, absolutely. There you go, Travis. Thank you for being my cameraman there. You've got this elastic band, and as you stretch it, that's you building that tension and suspense. Obviously holding it there is the suspenseful moment. But if you hold it there for too long, the audience get used to it. So like John's saying, you're relaxing that and letting them have some fun and letting them relax for a minute allows allows you to re-expand that, so you can pull not necessarily the same trick, but the same roller coaster a number of times. But there is also the reality that if you go too far, the band snaps and you don't kill the audience. That would be terrible. You lose the audience. You lose their investment. And I think that's often the thing, isn't it? In a brilliant like horror movie or horror story, is when everything's revealed to you and it's no longer scary because you're like, yeah, seen it now, seen that. What is it there? Is it still there? No, it's just an action film now. So I think that's a nice way to think about bringing the humor or the lighter side of things in, is that without the release of tension, you can't really sustain good moments of tension and suspense. You need to have that yin and yang. You need the balance.
And I think in horror role-playing in particular, it's very rare to find horror without humour. The two of them seem to be very heavily intertwined, just in general. I think there's a reason why so many comedians and comedic filmmakers end up having double careers writing horror. You see that a hell of a lot. And I think it's because they are fundamentally the same techniques. Telling a horror story is like telling a joke. You are building up tension and releasing it, as Newman said. And I think when we're playing games, it's very natural just to use humor as that release when the tension gets too much. You'll very rarely get a group where no one cracks a joke during a 3-hour game period. And most of the time, people are cracking jokes throughout, usually at the most tense moments in the game. And sometimes that works against the atmosphere that you're trying to create, but most of the time it's just part of the fun of playing, and that's fine.
As someone who regularly DMs comedians, oh my god! But there is an element also to that where but beforehand or after in a postmortem, and be like, okay, for the next session, guys, you're hilarious. I love every joke you're making, but also getting their buy-in on like making the horror stuff extra freaky. Like they can bring the same emotion, because big personalities like to have fun and like to be a little bit egotistical. That's a thing people do. Some people GM and other people like playing and being the center of attention. And that's okay. But giving them also the directive or motivation to also be like, instead of reaction laugh jokes when spooky stuff happens, to give the same sort of reaction, but toward the fear side, on a directive side, because I do a lot of recorded actual play stuff. Like that also can be quite effective in getting people from going too far to the comedy side and then making the campaign kind of more of like an Army of Darkness, unless it's your vibe. And but sometimes it can derail the campaign if you don't like rein it back just a little bit.
I think humor. I mean, as I said, isolation creates desperation, and outcome of die rolls and bizarre situation can create these like, what just happened? That is, everyone is sort of cracking up about. So I like that there is things happening. I think it's, it's also hard to be in a horror scenario, very focused, very tense for a long time, because after a while you need some sort of like release. But I kind of tend a little bit with Travis there. Sometimes I like it when it can also be, the release can also come in personal scenes where you have, another kind of, engagement with the characters, and they get a pause from the horror, and they something like that as well. So find a good rhythm. But again, it's different for different games and different groups, I think.
We had one of the most comedic deaths of all times, which is, we have a sneaky rogue, and the sneaky rogue is always sneaky, and she's invisible, and that's kind of her thing. And then the players are like, oh, well, we open the door. Oh, we see there's a monster behind it. She's like, all right, I'm going to run through. And then like, well, we close the door and then lock it. And then like, wait, oh, she's going through? Like, you didn't see her. Of course, you wouldn't know. That's out of character knowledge.
Oh.
So they locked her in the room with the monsters, and she died, and they didn't hear her scream. So like, it was objectively hilarious, and she loved how she died. Like that was the perfect send-off for her character after a very long campaign. And that's how she went. Just like, but it was effectively fun.
There are times where we just have to look back at the actions that are undertaken at the table and be like, yeah, I earned that.
Yeah. Sometimes having a great death is actually probably the most rewarding thing you can do as well in horror well. It's such a fun way to play. Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. We did get a comment there from one of the people in the chat. Humor is also a tool to release some tension in hard situations and to soothe oneself when things are grim. I would agree with that, personally. We are getting down towards the end of our time, so if I can do a quick once around, even though we're all industry people here, we're all professionals, what is one thing that each of you have learned on this panel, on this discussion today? Travis?
Mighty strong weather.
No, you leaned in.
There's mighty strong weather in England right now.
Okay, yeah, fair.
Yeah, there is.
No, I think there was a lot of good learnings and things that were brought up on isolation as a whole. I think when you would dive into it, this is not really a learning as such, but I think that isolation can probably, and the isolation and the conquest of the outcome of the isolation, even if it's the stew that we sort of swim in, it's also part of horror. It can probably look quite different depending on what kind of game it is that you can have. Because you can have isolation that is more, as Travis brought up, it's more about like we're marching over the sort of frozen fields in winter, and we have like sort of cannibalistic tribes, and we have our rations, and can we make it? It's more about like that kind of isolation, survival horror. How much things will we lose? That's also a kind of isolation that's more perhaps fantasy oriented. Than sort of horror oriented. So I think it's depending on what kind of genre and what kind of game, it will look very different.
I really liked Scott's thing with the authorities, like just making everything 100 times worse.
Yeah.
Yeah. And changing the type of isolation. I think a few people have talked about this. And then Scott typically put the last nail in the coffin with the idea of, you've been trapped. There might have been a little bit of, this is the environment, this is what's going on, here's the isolation. And then when they escape, they get on the boat, the isolation goes with them because the horror goes with them. So that's quite a nice vehicle to continue the story in a different dynamic, but also kind of, I suppose, metaphorically gut punch the characters that they haven't actually escaped the isolation or the horror because it's in the back.
Right, that it's inescapable. It's inescapable until you confront it, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Scott?
I've learned that I need a new ISP. But yeah, no, I think that a lot of our experiences as GMs and as creators seem to be pretty universal, that we've faced a lot of the same, well, maybe not difficulties, but challenges with creating these isolation environments in our games and presenting them with players and getting buy-in. And that, we've obviously all got our own individual techniques for dealing with them, but we seem to have a lot more in common with how we tackle these things than we do differently. So I guess fundamentally we're not that isolated.
That's a fair observation. So as we prepare to close out here, I would like to pose one final paired question to each of you. And that paired question is this. What is the current cool thing, or maybe the next cool thing you're working on, really exciting thing? And how can people find you if they want to talk about it? Patric?
All right. Well, for Cult of Infinite Lost, we will have quite a massive Kickstarter at the end of January with 2 big source books and 2 scenario collections. One of them, scenario collections, will have a lot of short stories. Perhaps some of them pretty similar to John's one-on-one stories, but there will be for broader set of players as well. So for Cult of the Lost, we will have that, and you can find us on X, Facebook, perhaps Blue Sky. I'm really bad at that. Perhaps I will tell our Herald to do that, and Instagram. And we also have, Discord server here tied to the Illusion HorrorCon. You can just join that one. So that's the big thing that's happening in my life right now.
Nice. John?
You can find me. I'm on Facebook as John Hook. I also have my podcast, Modern Mythos, on Facebook. And you can find the Modern Mythos podcast on pretty much every podcatcher. Just look for Modern Mythos. My podcasting partner, Seth Skorkowski, and I talk about Call of Cthulhu and investigative horror games. I was a participant in Oscar Rios recently had a Kickstarter to reprint a book of his that we had done, that I worked with him on a few years ago, the third Cthulhu Compendium, and a stretch goal on that was we're going to print a fourth Cthulhu Compendium, Black Seas of Infinity, and I'll have a new scenario in that as well. So I'm looking forward to that coming out. It's going to be a PDF only product, but maybe if it does enough sales, it'll eventually be promoted to a physical print, which that'll be nice. But I'm kind of excited for that one. It's a very it's a small horror story set in Kingsport. So it's not a end of the world kind of thing, but it could be the end of your character's world. So that could be motivation enough to get involved in it. But it's a neat little story, I think.
Very cool. Scott?
We've been doing this podcast, my friend Matt Sanderson and I, the good friends of Jackson Lies, for 12 years, and our third host, Paul Fricker, left recently. So we've been retooling the podcast, getting a cast of guest hosts to come in and fill the third position. We've just released the first of our new format episodes with Ross Bryant as our co-host, who was absolutely fantastic. An episode all about bringing historical settings to life in Call of Cthulhu. And so, I'm really excited about the new direction the podcast is taking. Check that out. You can find out more about the podcast in general and my work at blasphemoustomes.com, or you could follow me on Blue Sky, where I'm at S. Dorward. Good luck spelling that.
Ancient arcane script that it is. Newman?
You can find me on the interwebs through the Miskatonic Playhouse. If you type that into any socials, you'll find me at the helm of that on my podcast. You'll also find me as TA Newman everywhere, which makes it really good fun when you've got so many different things to check and post on. Writing wise, so we're always producing new podcasts, which is always really exciting. I'm often running them, and it's really great fun. We've got a lot of guest keepers and GMs coming on to run things, which is fantastic. I'm getting to be more of a player. In terms of writing, I've got the large-scale Cult and Culpability Cthulhu Regency book, hopefully coming out soon, but I'm not rushing it because my children keep stopping me from rushing it. So that will be it's a labour of love at this point, which I do still love. But I'm also dabbling in some modern horror, which I'm really excited about, actually. And I'm really enjoying playing with a few aspects of modern horror, playing with a little bit of technology and things, and how that, bizarrely, incorporates a sense of isolation into the player's experience. So I'll be able to hopefully tell us more about that in the future.
Very cool. Very cool. And last but certainly not least, we have Travis.
Hello, I'm Travis Vengroft. I am sound designing actively the newest season of The White Vault. It's a horror podcast, often set in the Arctic, a bit like The Thing. If you like The Thing, it's perfect for you. Or what's the other one that's set in the Arctic? No, my brain.
Alien versus Predator.
That one too. No, there's the ship, the Terror.
Oh, yes.
The Terror.
Oh,
that's the one.
Oh, yes, yeah.
watch The Terror, but also maybe check out The White Vault. It's a free horror podcast. And lastly, I also do Dark Dice. It's the one where you go into the woods and get chased by a shapeshifter who might be one of the players. It's up to you as the DM. Find out more and play it, or listen to our version with Jeff Goldblum on Dark Dice Pod.
Very, very cool. And I am Alan Patrick. I am on Blue Sky as Nerdy Alan because I want to keep that simple. I have largely abandoned most of the other platforms, but stuff that I'm working on, I do things. I'm a filthy freelancer. I think the most exciting thing I have in the cooker right now is Evil Dead 2, the RPG we are doing with Lynn Vander.
Ooh.
So that's going to be a bunch of fun. But outside of that, folks, this has been a very, very cool discussion about a topic that I hope to see more people explore in the future. And I hope your careers are dark and dreadful and trauma-inflicting, and I mean that in the best possible way.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.